Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrust health policy into the spotlight as this new disease destroys lives and damages communities and disrupts society in Europe and around the world. It has focused attention on society's lack of tools to fight it. The desperate quest for treatments and vaccines has yet to generate any purpose-built solution. And while that quest continues, researchers are also testing many existing medicines for other diseases in the hope of finding some that can be repurposed to help combat the pandemic, and with some recent small successes. There's nothing new about this approach of repurposing existing drugs. It's a time-honored process that has given rise to many invaluable therapies in many other diseases. Repurposed drugs are of value when fast development is required, and there's some insight into the biology of the disease. In repurposing drugs for COVID-19, collaborative groups have been the drivers of many clinical trials supported by public money. The organizers of this webinar, the Anticancer Fund, have been promoting the technique for nearly a decade, checking existing medicines to find new uses for them in the fight against cancer. Today, they want to explore the common ground between repurposing for COVID and repurposing for cancer, and to see whether there are lessons to be learned and interactions that could be useful in both the scientific and the policy spheres. COVID and cancer both have devastating effects on human health and happiness. Could this be an opportunity to reinforce the battle against both diseases? Certainly, that's what is implied in the title of this webinar: Drug Repurposing for Cancer in the COVID-19 Era, an opportunity for transformational change. My name is Peter O'Donnell. I'm a journalist in Brussels, and I shall be moderating this afternoon's meeting of experts from the worlds of research and regulation. I shall be looking out in particular for three things: how far it's possible to convincingly demonstrate the potential of repurposing, where are the principal obstacles to its development, and what actions and which actors can be identified to exploit that potential more effectively. After introductory statements, we shall have a panel discussion, and questions are also invited from registered participants. Since you're all muted, submit them via the Q&A button. And if you have any technical issues, use the chat box. We have a technical team on hand to deal with any problems. The meeting is also being broadcast simultaneously on YouTube, and the recording of it will remain on the Anticancer Fund's channel for further viewing. Slides from the meeting will also be available on the ACF website. And if you wish to comment on social media, there is also a hashtag, which is #ACFDrugRepurposing. Now, since repurposing is a policy issue as well as a science issue, it's fitting that we open the meeting with a welcome from a prominent member of Europe's policy framework, Lydie Meheus. Ms. Meheus is an MEP from Luxembourg with a background in education and national politics. She's a leading figure in the Green Group and has a particular interest in cancer. Her biography, incidentally, and those of the other speakers are in the conference pack and on the ACF website. So I will keep my introduction short and simply ask her to open our webinar. S'il vous plaît, Madame Meheus.
Merci beaucoup. Vous m'entendez? Good afternoon. You can see me, you can hear me?
Perfectly, welcome.
Oh, fine. I can see me, but that's no problem. So I'm very glad to be here. Welcome to this webinar, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to share it. And I would like to thank you all for joining and taking interest in this very important and topical webinar on drug repurposing. Since I joined the Parliament in 2018, I have dedicated my work to the fight against cancer, and particularly children cancer and rare diseases. And I will talk about what I know most. Pediatric oncology is an area where the off-label use is prevalent. With all the challenges it brings, difficulties to get reimbursement, differences between member states, problems of accessibility, uncertainty about the scientific evidence, and liability of the treating physicians. Plus, I would add, off-label use is also a problem when it comes to the pharmacovigilance of the drug used. So bringing such drugs on label would be enormously beneficial for patients, but also for the scientific community. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU did its best to support European healthcare system, but it appeared very clear that the lack of spending in our public healthcare systems for years lead to dramatic situation. In some member states, to healthcare workers being under an unbearable pressure and to patients with special needs being isolated. With different MEPs, we called a few weeks ago for a better coordination and more competences at the EU level to make our healthcare system more resilient in the face of pandemics, but also to put health at the forefront of our policy work in the European Union. Health is a major concern for citizens and an area of improvement for EU actions. Tackling major non-communicable diseases such as cancer is an example of where the EU can do more. I believe what the pandemic also taught us is that we have a huge issue when it comes to how we use a European public funding for health. When the EU earmarks funding, it goes most of the time with very little conditions to industry. And sorry for stating the obvious, but the pharma industry is tied by profit, not only by the best interest of patients. Current regulatory incentives are tailored to promote development of drugs by pharmaceutical companies, but it does not take into account many other factors and needs for patients or research. For example, we lack incentives for generating comprehensive clinical trials data and coordination mechanisms. This is also an important issue. Considering that the recovery from COVID-19 pandemic will come with financial constraints, it emphasizes even more the need to rethink how we allocate resources in the future. The cost of cancer medicine is importantly increasing. Conventional development of drugs can cost 10 times what drug repurposing could cost. As delivering affordable and accessible medicines will be more important than ever, drug repurposing represents an opportunity for transformational change in how to save money and how we deal with the ever-increasing burden of cancer. In that case, I believe that the Europeans Beating Cancer Plan and the European for Health Programme are excellent opportunities to raise this issue. I'm committed to contribute to do so in my work in the ENVI committee and strongly believe we need strategies to independently select the best treatment for patients, including repurposed drugs as one of the options. And for me, it goes without saying that we need more public funding for independent research at the European level to build strong centers of competence in the EU better serve the interest of patients. As I said, the European Union should have more competences to tackle challenges in the field of health, but the European Union already provides many tools also to implement improvements. And let me stress here the upcoming pharmaceutical strategy to this end. I'm glad that we will share some of very useful insights, and I'm sure we will have fruitful discussion during this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tilly. I'm particularly impressed by your desire to see some change. I noticed you said in a plenary debate a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago now, the crisis is an occasion to put into question all our views about health systems, and you made a particular appeal for investment to ensure access in the best health for everyone. Because you've now got the pharmaceutical strategy, the cancer mission, the cancer plan, the EU for health, and the shortages on which I think you're a co-reporter as well.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot to play for now, and it would be very interesting to see how Envy and your other colleagues in the Parliament move this one forward. So thank you very much indeed for being here this afternoon. I understand
you Peter.
Stay with us for a short time as well, so many thanks. Now, to set the scene of the intersection of science and policy, I turn to the Managing Director of the Anticancer Fund, Lydie Meheus, herself a researcher, but now focused for more than a decade on the development of cancer treatments, regardless of their commercial value. Dr. Meheus, Lydie, please outline the key issues in repurposing from your perspective.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for being with us on this sunny afternoon. Can I have the first slide, please? Let me briefly introduce the Anticancer Fund. We are a not-for-profit research organization. We are based in Belgium, but we work internationally, and we are focusing on the development of cancer treatments that are outside the scope of the pharma industry. So next slide. So the question is drug repurposing outside the scope of commercial enterprises? And I must say that the answer is nuanced, and it really depends on the return on investment. Let me explain that by making use of the 4 scenarios as they have been described by Christopher Austin from INCATS, and that you can see here. And I have illustrated them with some examples that may be familiar to you. We have Viagra, which is a very successfully repurposed drug. Then we have the drugs that are being repurposed currently in COVID, tocilizumab, anakinra, anti-rheumatic drugs, and remdesivir as an antiviral. Then we have thalidomide, which was taken off the market, but has been repurposed also very successfully for multiple myeloma. I think it's clear that for those 3 scenarios, there are commercial incentives. So it's in a way taken care of, at least for some indications, maybe not for all. But I would like to focus on the 4th scenario in this webinar. And this is the scenario that is different because we have cheap generic drugs and clinicians have them at hand if they want to help their patients. Next slide. And that's exactly what has been happening in COVID-19. We have identified 181 drugs that are currently generic drugs, that are currently used in over 600 registered trials. And as you can see, more than 25% of these trials make use of hydroxychloroquine, quite famous in the meantime. So, but this scenario of repurposing generic drugs has been going on for many years already in oncology. And based on scientific evidence, meaning preclinical data, mechanism of action, early clinical data, and so on, we have identified 280 generic drugs that are expected to be beneficial for patients. You can find this information, it's publicly available in the REDO database. And there are more than 700 trials making use of these drugs. But all these trials are driven by investigators or by research institutes or by foundations. Next slide, please. So what have we learned from COVID is that this type of small exploratory trials can be useful, but that they also can be harmful if they are badly executed. And most importantly, we have seen that these data are really insufficient for clinical decision-making. Next slide, please. So if we really want the clinical answers for COVID, we have seen that these answers are coming from large multi-arm trials. And I think a very good example is the recovery trial in the UK that has demonstrated finally that hydroxychloroquine does not work and that dexamethasone has positive results. And it's this type of approach that we really would like to see in oncology, especially in rare cancers and in pediatrics. This type of multi-arm platform trials for each indication. Then you have like one standard of care control arm, and you have head-to-head comparison of different treatments, and you can think of even comparing repurposed drugs and new drugs in the same setup. There are already some good examples in oncology, and to name one, it's the STAMPEDE, and this is a multi-arm trial in the UK for prostate cancer. Next slide, please. So I think that in the end, we all want the best treatment for the patient. But if the competent authorities have to judge and select, they need really robust data, and these data have to come from rigorously designed trials and from large trials. And those platform trials, I think, can really serve that goal. And it's also important to note that the same trials should serve both the need for EMA and hopefully also for European HTA. Next slide, please. Of course, setting up these large platform trials is obviously quite an investment that cannot really be expected from industry. So I think that if we want to keep the drugs affordable, then public money has to be invested in this type of infrastructure. And then eventually both nonprofit and industry can contribute by paying for their own arm in the study. And that's exactly what is happening in the STAMPEDE trial, the example I have been giving. Next slide, please. The question is, of course, this is all hopefully future, but where are we today? I must say that drug repurposing has been on the agenda of the European Commission since 2017. And the STAMP expert group, in collaboration with nonprofits, FPIA, Medicines for Europe, they agreed on a framework where nonprofits can pay for scientific advice to assure that the trials they support will meet the regulatory requirements. And then they can offer these clinical data to the market authorization holder, but they are fully dependent on the willingness of the market authorization holder to apply for label extension. If there is no interest from the market authorization holder, then nothing will happen and there will be no proper evaluation of the data by the regulators. Next slide, please. So I would like to end with actually a proposal. I think that if we really want to bring the best treatment to the patient, we need for-profit drug development for new drugs, but we also need a complementary strategy and that should be supported by public money for the development of affordable treatments that are beneficial for patients. Note that this strategy will not only serve drug repurposing, but also other non-commercial developments, like therapy optimization and de-escalation, and some more, but those could be topics for another webinar, so I will leave it here, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydie. We'll plan the next webinar when we finish this one. But what seems clear from your outline is that while there is great theoretical potential in repurposing, and particularly in the repurposing you're using, focusing on the patient rather than on the profit, there are still multiple practical barriers that will have to be overcome to realize that potential. There are gaps in what commercial research has achieved, but for independent clinical research to fill those gaps, there will have to be a suitable clinical, regulatory, and economic framework. Our next speaker is eminently well placed to comment on this challenge, the widely respected Hans-Georg Eichler. Dr. Eichler hardly needs any introduction, but as Senior Medical Officer of the European Medicines Agency, he has a central role in coordinating and advising the agency's scientific committees. He played a leading role in the development of thinking on adaptive licensing. His background as a professor of pharmacology, in drug reimbursement in his native Austria, and in industry gives him a unique perspective. Dr. Eichler, the EMA's recently finalized regulatory strategy for 2025 confirmed the support for the idea of a repurposing framework. It would be very interesting if you could expand a little on how far that has implications for today's webinar, but I hand the microphone over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for a nice introduction. And thank you also for pointing out our drug regulatory strategy, or science strategy, which indeed mentions repurposing as a worthwhile undertaking that we wish to support. But before we get too enthusiastic, allow me to share some thoughts from a regulatory perspective. And I'm keenly aware that some of these thoughts may take some of you outside your comfort zone. So I ask for your apologies up front, and please don't shoot the messenger. I will then try to discuss a few things that we can do to help that, to support that endeavor. And finally, Lydie asked me also to make a few comments on the platform trials that she already described briefly. So some regulatory thoughts, and I invite you to share with me a thought experiment. You are an academic group that has had a very good idea that an old drug X off patent, generic, could now be useful in a very, say, rare cancer. You have done a clinical study and the results look actually quite good. It may not be a cure-all, but it's reasonable, few drugs are, but it's reasonably good. You now approach me and I am the marketing authorization holder. Now, I'm not just interested in profits. I want to do good. I'm philanthropic. So my first concern is not what's in for me money-wise, but I have a first thought that is, well, that trial that these people did, will it hold water? Will it be up to snuff to regulatory standards? Has it been done according to good clinical practice standards? What will happen when the regulators go in and send their inspectors to the sites? I will be the marketing authorization holder if I make an application for an extension of indication. Well, I have to vouch for these results. And I'm saying this not out of the blue, but we have heard this from companies that whenever they are approached with such a proposal by academics, their first concern is, Well, how good are these data? So that is to make everybody aware that if you want to come to your friendly regulator, or less friendly, your data will have to live up to a certain standard. And I do appreciate that this may be an issue. We can discuss later on. So that's my first key question that I have and concern. But here is my second one that hasn't yet been mentioned. Let's say everything goes well. I get a license, an extension of license for that new repurposed indication. Well, that is not the end of the story. That is the beginning of the story. Don't forget, in 2012, a new European legislation has come into effect, the pharmacovigilance legislation. It has already been mentioned. It's not just in Europe, it's in all major jurisdictions. And that means that if you have a product on the market for one or more indications, there is a lot of obligations. And pharmacovigilance has already been mentioned. Now you could argue, well, if you get a new indication added to what you already had, so what? We know a lot about the safety of that drug. Well, that may be true, but you have to do continuous benefit risk assessments, and that is indication specific. So you have to do something in that indication. There is life, so to speak, after birth of a new indication. You may have, depending on circumstances, have to do post-authorization efficacy, safety studies. You may, in some cases, have to do a pediatric investigation plan. So as a marketing authorization holder, I have now sort of inherited that extended indication, but with it comes a lot of liabilities. And to some, when that new legislation came into force, I had a converted pharma company executive who said, well, with all that, now getting a license indications for a drug, to bring a drug on the market, is like a commitment to do lifelong research. The answer is yes, absolutely. So be aware of all these exigencies that come with repurposing if you want an extended indication. So my third thought now is, well, what's the expected revenue? And if the expected revenue is either zero or close to zero, well, can you give me a good reason why I, the marketing authorization holder, should say yes? So I'm saying that to highlight the issues that come with finding new purposes for older drugs. It doesn't come entirely free. Yes, it is more efficient. Of course it is, but it isn't entirely free. So there are strings attached. So what we need, and I fully concur with Lydie and others, that we will need some form of rewards if we want to stimulate that kind of research and that kind of undertakings. And there I see some similarities between what this group is trying to do, the Anticancer Fund, and the situation that we find with antimicrobial resistance, where we also need some kind of new incentives to get this going. So now, after the bad news, what could EMA do, the regulator, to help you, to help that take off the ground? Well, what we have, and we are very much willing to do, is dispense advice. And I'm not talking only about our official scientific advice and the various fora that we have in place, and I'm sure that you're familiar. I'm talking about informal advice. That means you can call someone at EMA, and they cannot help you get the drug on the market, but what they can do is they can take you by the hand and lead you through what I admit is probably, to an outsider, a regulatory labyrinth. They can tell you what is feasible, what is not feasible. They can tell you where you can expect what we call regulatory flexibility, but they can also tell you what we cannot do. And what we cannot do is waive conditions. For example, the post-licensing obligations. We cannot waive that. We cannot look the other way. because it is an academic group, because it is a repurposed drug. There cannot be a dual standard for that. So we can guide you, and I think that could be, if you take that outstretched hand, that could be very valuable help. That's one thing. The other thing, we have to talk about fees. And it has already been mentioned, we are keenly aware that our fees are steep. Not if you are a multinational pharma giant, but if you are an academic group trying to repurpose something that has little commercial value. So we can do two things. Well, we can first we can waive the fees. And by coincidence, today or yesterday, I forget, on our website, we announced that we will now waive fees for academic groups who wish to develop orphan drugs. So that should help. It may not help in all situations, but it will help in many situations. So we can waive those fees for scientific advice. As has already been mentioned, we would encourage grant givers who support financially, like the European Commission, others, who support such endeavors, to also consider fees that are incurred at various stages to be part of the grant. And this is probably something that we should all consider is a part of a normal development process. And then there's a third option, and this is a very personal view. This is not an EMA view, but it's my view. Why would you not set up a small medium enterprise, an SME? Then you can always get the fee waiver, because that is in place. There is a framework for that. You have certain rights as an SME. Why don't you do that? And maybe that should lead into another thought. And let me rather say, I've word this as a question. Is it a wise idea to try to develop a drug, a repurposed drug, on a part-time basis? So I know many academic groups have had good ideas and some have floundered. Maybe you cannot just do this. You cannot build a rocket or you cannot build a new airplane on a part-time basis. Maybe this needs professionalization. And maybe if you work in clinic in the morning or you teach in the afternoon, you will not be able to pull off that trick. But that is something, as I say, I word it as a question that we can perhaps discuss afterwards. Maybe you should inject that dose of professionalism and full-timeism into that endeavor. Now, I come to my last point, and Lydie has already introduced her thoughts on platform trials. From our perspective, is this a good idea? And the short answer is absolutely yes. And we have seen what this can do. We have seen, and it's already been mentioned, the recovery trial. It showed that you can, with one control group, kind of kill two birds with one stone. Absolutely a good idea if it is well designed, if it is well conducted. Of course, we would support that. Of course, this is the right thing to do. But again, here is a caveat from experience. The reason why this works in COVID is because everybody is doing this now in a synchronized way. So we had these X number of repurposing ideas all coming at the same time. This is when you can do such a trial. To nudge industry and the these trials. And that was in the pediatric arena. Because we don't have enough, there is different reasons, we don't have enough pediatric patients to test all these drugs that are coming out. And we immediately ran into a very practical problem. There were 3 companies developing a product for one condition. The first product was ready for a large study, let's say in July 2020. The next product would have been ready, say in May 2021. And the third product, again, half a year later. What do you do in that situation? Should you wait until the last one is ready? Not a good idea for many reasons. But you see that the practicalities can make this rather difficult and challenging. So it will only work if and when you have, for one patient group, and it must be the same patient group, obviously, you have, for one indication, one defined patient group, several products that you can test at exactly the same time. When that condition is fulfilled, then it's probably the ideal thing to do. And I will stop on that hopefully positive note. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Hans-Georg. Indeed, a positive note there at the end, which might have given just a slight scintilla of hope to those generics languishing in purgatory at the moment. I wonder if you feel that the balance of need and provision in terms of cancer drugs is in any way absolutely unmeetable through these non-profit exercises. Your cautions were very clear. Does this make you feel that it's something in the absence of professionalism and full-time engagement that really is not a practicable way ahead?
No, I would not, definitely not be so negative. Absolutely not. I think if we can meet those two conditions, one is incentives at the right time, the right incentives, and two, the full-timeism. I shy away from saying professionalism because the opposite is amateurism. And I would in no way say that people who do this are amateurs in the negative sense of the word. But I think it requires so much more than just having a good idea and running a good trial. Project management. Where do you get the material from? How do you package? So there are so many logistic things that I think it calls for full-timeism. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. It does to a great extent. At least it leaves the gap open. Now, Stamp ran the inquiry that Lydie alluded to in her remarks on repurposing. Lydie's pointed out some of the challenges that remain in that. There was supposed to be a pilot project run at the end of that, sometime I think earlier this year it should have started, which might have helped to assess how far the ideas that were discussed in Stamp could or couldn't function. Are you able to tell us anything more about what was the follow-up there, what the possibilities are of actually conducting a pilot? I know it got knocked off course rather by the COVID outbreak. And there has been some discussion of possibly using the COVID-19 experience in repurposing as a sort of surrogate pilot. Could you just talk us briefly through a little of that to tell us how you see the status of that?
So the STEM pilot, the STEM pilot is officially, as you say, on hold because of COVID. Now, Lydie is probably closer to this matter and she could answer some of your questions. But look, the key question is, could COVID be like a surrogate pilot? I don't know. I think the jury is still out. And we hear exactly the same from industry, big pharma, saying, look, COVID prompted all of us to do things differently. Why can't we keep that as the new normal? And our response, our position is, shall we say, guarded. Of course, a crisis can be a very good thing to shake things up. You learn, and then you do some things different. On the other hand, will we likely do everything the same once COVID is over? And the answer is probably not. Don't forget, COVID is an exceptional situation. Would we want to do everything in future the way we do it now? And the answer is probably not. So what we are doing now, and that is true for my agency, and it probably may be true for the STEMP pilot. We will look at the lessons learned, and we will then say, what can we continue and what should we not continue? So for example, I spoke to clinical trials. Can we in future amend GCP in such a way that we can allow decentralized trials, remote monitoring, some things we have to do now because of the COVID situation, etc. Will that give us a jolt to change? The answer is likely yes, but I think it's too early to say now, yes, this we will keep, and therefore COVID is like a bit of a surrogate, but in other ways it is not. So I think it will be shades of gray rather than black and white when you ask, is this a surrogate pilot? But I would hope that Lydie can answer some of the other questions that you have asked about the.
I'm sure we'll get the chance to pose them to her as well. Thank you very much for that for the moment. You're staying on, I understand, for our panel discussion and Q&A, so I'd be very grateful perhaps to pick up one or two other elements of that at that point. But for the moment, perhaps I can also turn to the other aspect of regulation that we have that we have on the agenda today. Because obviously the role of regulators, particularly of the EMA, is one of the key influences in this discussion. But another equally influential factor is, of course, the European Union itself. And we'll now have the benefit of insights from someone at the heart of the EU's engagement with cancer. Jan Willem van der Leeuw is the team leader for cancer in the European Commission's Research Department, DG RTD, and is also a key figure in the EU's nascent cancer mission. As his full biography on the ACF website makes clear, he is a scientist as well as a senior official, and his many distinctions in that field include a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the European Institute of Oncology in Milan. I would add also that he's not taking part in the panel session Q&A later. So if you have questions for him, send them in now, and we'll see if time allows us to pose any of them to him after his remarks. So, Dr. van der Leeuw, welcome. Nice to be with you. Tell us, please, how drug repurposing fits into the Commission view and how far it may be taken into account in the cancer mission, which you have today, just this afternoon, released your first outlines of thinking about, which we all are going to be reading avidly as soon as we finish this webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. van der Leeuw.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Peter. You're spot on. We published it today, the 5 mission outlines. So we are very pleased because it's...
And as I said, their biographies are all on the ACF website. So after the broad brushstroke introductions we have, we're going to turn to our expert panel to look at some very specific issues. The title of the panel itself is self-explanatory: forward-thinking solutions and policy responses to incentivize clinical research and bring repurposed drugs into oncology practice. And given the emphasis that Hans-Georg, among others, put on incentives, I think it's one of the things that is likely to emerge over and over again in our discussions. I'm going to ask each of our 4 distinguished panelists in turn to present their perspective in 3 or 4 minutes on how the scientific or clinical or medical expertise might be better deployed, and whether their aspirations are occasionally frustrated by broader operating context for them, and what they think needs to change at the local or regional, national, European, international level. We're going to be covering a lot of ground, and to maximize the time available, including for questions from participants, our panelists have kindly agreed to keep their introductory remarks fairly brief, and then to keep their answers as short as possible, consistent, of course, with the inevitable complexity of the subject. So first, we turn to Nicolas André. Bonjour, Nicolas, from the Hôpital pour Enfants de la Timone in Marseille. And he's a professor in pediatric oncology in the Department of Hematology and Pediatric Oncology there, among his many other influential posts in cancer research. He has a declared interest and some considerable experience in the subject of drug repurposing. So please, Professor André, give us an outline of the challenges you face in cancer research and how independent clinical trials can perhaps help minimize uncertainty about the degree of clinical benefit offered by a new medicine.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Indeed, you can. With great
Perfect.
pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for setting this webinar and having me. It's really exciting for me to share our thoughts on this tricky topic. So I will, of course, focus on what I know a bit about is pediatric oncology and drug repurposing for kids with cancer. But before focusing on it, I had like two thoughts that I wanted to share that comes from the COVID pandemic. First of all, is that beyond the frustration that I met trying to set this clinical trial with drug repurposing in oncology, it's amazing how many bad clinical trials have been financed and funded and set with COVID, with any drugs, wrong doses, poor design. So I mean, it's really frustrating to see that how we were struggling to try to set nice trial and how money has been spent on doing anything. But oh well, I guess we're trying to fulfill unmet needs. That was my first point. My second point is why I got into drug repurposing. And I think it's interesting here again in an area of COVID pandemia is that what I really wanted to do when I do my own research, I'm not talking about setting the classical phase 1, phase 2 studies with drugs from pharmaceutical company that we need, but I really wanted to come up with projects that could help developing green, sustainable, global drugs for kids with cancer. It means all over the world, easy to access, and with low toxicity and non-toxicities. And I think this is still something that we should aim at. And I think like there are many drugs that can help us reach that goal. And to try to highlight the problem that I faced, I want to focus on one trial that is not completed, that is a phase 1 trial using 2 repurposed drugs for children with a brain cancer that is called low-grade glioma. And so that came from research that was performed in our institution, and we used fluvastatin, which is a drug that is supposed to lower cholesterol, and celecoxib, which is a COX inhibitor. And so we set that trial. First of all, it was really hard to fund that trial, and hopefully the Anticancer Fund was of a great help. The trial is now completed. Not all the French centers participated because they were not interested in that approach. But I mean, the trial was successful because we got like over 50% of the disease that are controlled after 6 months, which is the kind of standard that you want for new drugs for this disease. And now we're facing the next step. And we kind of stuck because of several reasons. And that will be the starting point for the discussion afterwards. First of all, our own colleagues may not be interested in these old drugs. It's not sexy, it's not targeted. So that's I guess one of the first and main issues. I'm more interested in BRAF inhibitors and MEK inhibitors. The second point, which is maybe a good point, is that some of these drugs don't have clear targets. So since we're moving to precision medicine, we don't really know how they work. So we don't really know how they don't work. So it's hard to incorporate them in the different tools that we have. Then sometimes also an issue for parents and patients. You want to treat me with a drug that lower cholesterol when they're used to chemotherapy and radiotherapy and immunotherapy. So sometimes it's also hard to convince them that it can bring something. The second point is we don't have real partners. It's so much easier to develop a drug trial when you have like a pharma company. You got the drug right away, you got the money, you got all the lobbying. So this is something that we must, I think, work globally on, so that to help us convince all the stakeholders. And of course, the big issue is funding. Sometimes when you come up with this proposal, you got review for your grant saying basically it's not sexy any longer. They're not interested. Even if you come up with nice science behind it, potentially new mechanism of action, drug and targets that are not targetable by current drugs, it doesn't look sexy. So I guess these are the main issues that we all face as clinicians trying to develop this approach. And when you come to pediatrics, it's even, I guess it's double trouble because you have like a low number of patients, frail patients. So it's sometimes also issues that stakeholders don't want to get involved in. And I guess I don't want to take too much time, so that will be it for me.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that as an intro. Can I ask you, first of all, how you feel when you, as I'm sure you listened with great attention to what Dr. Eichler was saying earlier on, when he made his rather cautious remarks or issued some cautions about the limits of non-profit repurposing. What's your response to what he was saying?
I actually don't have I don't have the answer, unfortunately. I guess we just have to develop the global business plan to develop this strategy. So I guess it doesn't come from one single action. I guess we have to impact both on government so that they understand that these drugs are not expensive, and we have to work with different companies because the benefits shall be different. We have to work with the people at the EMEA and the urban committee, so we will have like specific calls. And we also have to learn to work, as someone said previously, professionally, because we know basically how to make clinical trial, but there are huge steps between setting a successful clinical trial and turning the drugs that are being used into treatment for patients on a daily basis. So I guess that must...
Sorry, go on. Please go on.
So I guess I don't have like one answer. I get a different direction that we have to work on, but in a very constructed way, I'd say.
When you presented the results of your phase 1 trial at a CEOP meeting, I think on the fluvastatin last autumn, and it was regarded as quite successful, I understand. What's happened since? Has it just come to a complete stop? You said obviously you're having difficulty in a number of areas of following that up. Where precisely on that trial are you running into difficulties in moving ahead to further?
Well, I think there are many new, I'd say, real drugs. I know it's not the right way to say it, but like a pharma company called drug that are on the market. So it's hard to compete. And the kind of trial we would like to do to demonstrate that this treatment is useful, well, it's almost impossible. Just trying to think how to set it, but it's almost impossible. Not only money-wise, but just like we have, and I guess the first hurdle here would be to convince our colleague that it's worth it.
When you talked earlier on about the bad trials that were very frustrating to see money going into some rather poorly designed or indifferently conducted COVID trials. Where do you see, because funding, you also mentioned, is one of your difficulties, money was being poured, you suggested, into some bad work there. By whom? Why are these people doing it like that? What can be done to influence those sort of decisions? Again, there's, I'm sure, no one answer, but you're faced with very practical problems. So you're working in defined spaces, defined geographies, defined culture. Where do you go to change that? Where do you go to change the criteria or competence of allocation of resources so that some of the things that you believe are going to be very valuable can be pursued?
Well, I guess, I mean, the COVID thing is not, I guess this is not going to be the way it should be working, right? We understand it's something new and it was such a global threat. So to some extent, I understand that a lot of money was put into it, and not with the necessarily right criteria regarding quality. But when it comes to drug repositioning, well, I guess maybe some of the when, you know, in research, when you got something that you know that's going to work, you put all your money on this. When you don't know the solution, you have to split the money and try different strategies. So I guess it's just a matter of saving some money for alternative way of seeing things. And the way European programs are built, it's more or less that they keep building and funding the same networks with the same kind of way of thinking. And so it, to some extent, does not facilitate like new concepts or new ideas. So I guess we should save money for, I mean, we got an area here that is well identified with, I mean, with a great potential that everyone's acknowledged. So I guess some money has to be saved for that field.
You forgive me for pressing you on the point. I'm only a simple journalist. So You use the passive tense there very artfully, saying that some money should be saved and some decisions should be made. What I'm trying to get at, without putting you in any embarrassing situations, who, where is making the decisions, and what have they got to do, and what have you got to do to make them see that your point is stronger than their point? And who can you make alliances with to do that?
Well, I guess you have to grow slowly. So that's, I guess, to me, that this very trial that we have completed now is the kind of first step that should help us convince people. But, you know, it's not all about science. It's also about belief. When it comes to belief, it's like different issues.
It's also perhaps about policy. I mean,
also, yes.
These things are set by, at the top level, by political and policy decisions. Is there, in your experience, a clear understanding at senior political levels of the importance of having more than one approach to drug development?
I'm not such a good political person, so I don't have that much experience regarding this. So I guess we should ask the other participant maybe about that.
Let's do that. All right. Well, thank you very much for the moment. We can come back and bounce some more questions off you as we go through the panel. But thank you very much for the moment. Now, we'd like to hear the view of an expert from the patient perspective. Delphine Heenan is the founder, director, and day-to-day manager of a Belgian NGO called Kick Cancer, which is dedicated to the search for innovative treatments. She's also the mother of a cancer patient and has relinquished her career as a lawyer and businesswoman to concentrate on this work full time. Delphine, tell us the experience that you've had and what lessons there are in that for the people that we're talking to and with today.
Well, the first lesson I had was before I actually founded Kick Cancer. It's when I received the diagnosis of relapse for my son, and he was proposed a off-label drug, which consequentially was not reimbursed in Belgium. So it had really tangible impact for us because we had to pay for the treatment. And so it's basically probably the first lead that brought me and my family to found Kick Cancer, because we really felt like we had to understand why the best drug in his situation was not considered as suitable for use in pediatrics. And so my experience with off-label drug first came as very practical. Now, the experience of any patient in pediatric oncology is an experience of off-label drugs, because there are hardly, I attended a presentation a couple of days ago, and according to the FDA, there are only 30 drugs in pediatric oncology which are used on label, which doesn't mean that they haven't been properly tested and they are not known as effective and with a acceptable toxicity for children. But it only means that we have a hard time filling the gap between the actual research for drugs in pediatric oncology and the later approval on label of those drugs. That's why I naturally came in contact with the Anticancer Fund, because it really felt important to understand what are the legislative gaps that can be filled. I have a past as a lawyer, so I couldn't help thinking that was important, but what are the legislative gaps that have to be filled to make sure that any given drug which is regarded as efficient and safe, I mean, in terms of risk benefits for patients, should be brought on label. So that's how I came to it. And I'm really interested to react also to the comment made by Nicola about the difficulty to have a clinical trial with repurposed drugs financed in the field of pediatric oncology. And one of the main reasons why it is so complicated, according to me, is that there is a steep competition for patients. Pediatric cancers being rare, it's very difficult to actually recruit patients. And I fully understand that it might be even more difficult when you talk to financing non-for-profit organizations of research in the field of pediatric oncology to convince them to finance a trial with an old drug repurposed instead of something sexy and innovative. And I really believe that to a certain extent that we need to build communication bridges between people who are trying to have those trial finance. I mean, I'm regularly in contact with Lydie Meheus, so I know the competitive advantage of off-label drugs, of older drugs, the toxicity profile of which is well known, which gives a tremendous guarantees, because any innovative drug is a jump into the unknown territory of long-term side effects. These are definitely things that should happen. There are many forums in the field of pediatric oncology, discussion forums, and they're very much focused on innovation. And I really believe that discussion on repurposing of older drugs should be brought to those forums. It would be a very welcome refresher.
Okay, thanks. You said your background was as a lawyer, which helps in the work you're doing at the moment, but your background, as I mentioned, is also as a businesswoman, which relates also to one of the first points you made, which is that there is a cost here. Off-label use is perhaps not the first choice in any circumstance, but in some circumstances is the only option. But as you were saying yourself, there's a heavy cost there as well. Now, this takes us into a slightly different area of discussion, because the whole idea of repurposing is not necessarily just to save money but is there an important economic element to this discussion overall that is not being taken sufficiently seriously by the policymakers?
Well, we already discussed the cost or the difficulty to have the administrative process financed by philanthropy. I think that one of the hidden costs of keeping drugs off label is that they are not reimbursed in many countries, which makes access difficult for patients. And when patients do not get access to the best drug, I mean, they might either die or end up with lesser drugs, which can cause long-term side effects. And when you think about the population I am representing, which is the patient of children and young adults with cancer, it is a population that once cured has long years to live after treatment. And so looking for drugs with a safe toxicity profile should definitely be a priority. And so when I hear about a diabetes drug, or any other drug with a very good safety profile, I have a hard time not understanding why they are not being more encouraged. Okay,
well, thank you for that for the moment. Again, we'll come back. There's many points here to follow up, but I'm going to move on now, if I may, to hear the view of an expert from a different perspective. This is Bissal Ghewali, who is today an assistant professor in the public health sciences, as well as a scientist and clinical fellow in epidemiology and oncology at Queen's University in Kingston in Canada. He's also affiliated to the Brigham Hospital in Boston. He knows the Anticancer Fund well because he used to be its medical consultant. He's also a prolific author and editor. So in that case, Bissal, give us, if you will, some insights from your experience in meeting the challenges that come up in drug repurposing.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be a part of this wonderful panelist here today. I'll give my perspective as a clinician and as a cancer policy researcher. So first, as a clinician, I think when I interact with my patients, the patients, they do not have a bias against repurposed drugs. In fact, I see more and more patients who want to try repurposed drugs. So that bias, I don't feel there, but where I feel bias is when I talk with clinicians and researchers or trialists. As Nicholas has already mentioned and Delphine also mentioned, these old repurposable generic drugs are not sexy. So when a trialist, a researcher has an option to put a trial of immunotherapy, pembrolizumab, or to put a patient in a trial of mebendazole, an old generic drug, then everyone has a bias to put the patient on the trial of a newer drug instead of putting on an older drug. Now, how can we overcome that bias? And now that's a very difficult task ahead of us. But from the cancer policy point of view, I also see a big bias in that, as Dr. Eichler was also mentioning from his perspective as a regulator, we tend to put cancer drug, the repurposable cancer drugs to, in my opinion, sometimes at a higher standard of evidence, then we put these newer other drugs. What astounds me is that we are approving these newer drugs, these sexy new drugs, that have a response rate of only 5% or even 6% or 10%, which is quite minimal gain. But we are talking about, but when we talk about repurposable drugs, we are putting them to a higher evidentiary standard. And I think that shouldn't happen, because these repurposable drugs, they have a lot of societal benefit, economic benefit, and I think it should be in the interest of the public and the public agencies to test them in a proper way. I'm not saying that these repurposable drugs, older generic drugs, should get an easy pass or should be held to a lower evidentiary standard. I'm saying that they should be held to the same evidentiary standard as we hold our other drugs. And then comes the question about funding. Who is going to fund those trials? Of course, we need phase 3 randomized trials to definitely show that these older drugs are good drugs. But who is going to fund for that? And this COVID example gives us a lot of food for thought, a lot of things to think about. If you look at COVID, now let's look at a couple of drugs. Let's look at remdesivir and let's look at hydroxychloroquine. So when remdesivir data was out, the manufacturer, because it is an on-patent drug, the manufacturer filed for emergency use authorization in the United States, and it got that authorization. And so now there is no problem with using the drug. But let's talk about hydroxychloroquine. It failed. That's a different story. But before we knew that this drug failed, and because of all the politics involved with hydroxychloroquine, the emergency use authorization that hydroxychloroquine obtained was because the US Department of Health and Human Services filed for EUA. Because it's a generic drug. So the US Department of Health and Human Services had to file on its behalf and get an EUA from the FDA for use. It failed later and it was revoked. That's a different story. But there was no manufacturer or nobody with knowledge of that whole legislative process, like an independent agency, who could file for its use, just like in the case of remdesivir, where the Gilead filed for its use. Now, dexamethasone, we know from the recovery trial, has improved survival in COVID-19, and it has wonderful data. But technically, if nobody files for its use, then use of dexamethasone in COVID-19 would be considered as off-label use. That would be technically it would still be off-label use, even though we have such wonderful data for dexamethasone in COVID-19. Now, who is going to do that?
I think, forgive me, I'd like to sort of ask you there, and we can come back to this later. I think it's a very important point, the extent to which that demonstration of an off-label use in these emergency circumstances carries messages for the broader discussion of cancer that we're having today. I'm going to just switch over briefly. We'll come back to Bissell on that. And I want to also bring in Hans-Georg, if I may, to comment on your observation about the differential standards. But before that, perhaps I can ask Matthew Hall from the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences in the United States, who's been patiently sitting there waiting for his turn at the mic. He leads a team of translational scientists focusing on developing probe molecules for orphan targets and advancing new small molecule therapeutics through collaborative research. He's right on target for this discussion, Matthew, because you've got experience, as you said earlier on, both in the COVID collaborative research and in the overall work of NCATS and NIH. So perhaps you can tell us where you're finding the challenges, and particularly what you're finding from your COVID experience recently, and where you can see that that offers any hint of solutions to some of the problems we're discussing.
Hi, thanks, Peter. Yeah, so I work at NCATS, which is part of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And our focus is really on, a big part of our focus is developing or identifying therapeutic options for patients with rare diseases. That includes rare cancers. And my background in research is in rare cancer. So drug repurposing is a really big part of what we do at NCATS. There are 7,000 rare diseases. There are hundreds of rare cancers. It's not practical to identify new therapeutic solutions in a traditional sense for all of them. And so repurposing is an exciting way to try and identify effective treatment options. COVID-19 is not rare, unfortunately, and it's not neglected. And so it's an interesting comparison point, but it's a difficult one because basically, as I think some people have touched on, and I'm not going to talk about chloroquine, but almost every roadblock to development has been removed for COVID-19. It's been really remarkable how rapidly progress is being made. And it's been a test case for what is possible. I think I've seen people work together and try things and implement studies that may have led to some mistakes or some less exciting science getting a lot of attention than it normally would. But it's allowed science to move forward clinically in a way that we normally don't see. And I'll just give you some examples from a collaborative network point of view. We've been working with partners in Europe, such as Aatris, on sharing data that we would never share, sharing data a week after we generated on our robots using libraries of approved drugs, both generic, off-patent, and on-patent drugs, and looking for opportunities to find treatment options for patients who really need them. And of course, the imperative has been that when COVID-19 came around, there were no COVID-19 experts, there were no coronavirus therapeutics. And so drug repurposing has received a lot of attention because we need therapeutics right now. And so I wonder that while COVID-19, I think will let us take away a lot of lessons for what works and what doesn't work that we can apply to other challenges such as cancer, where repurposing has already demonstrated to be a really valuable proposition from a patient benefit perspective. I think things like rare diseases and neglected diseases might be a better comparison point. The Drugs for Neglected Diseases Institute in Europe has had wonderful success identifying and redirecting existing therapeutics to benefit patients for diseases that rarely receive attention and certainly don't get a lot of research funding directed towards them. 80% of all drugs are off patent, and every year, technically, there are new drugs that are now off patent and technically can become generics. So there are more and more drugs to play with and identify as repurposing opportunities in this space that we're discussing today all the time. I guess two things that I'm hearing when I thread through what people have discussed, and remember, I'm an Australian in the United States, so I've got a few different perspectives from the European one that we're hearing today. But partnering with regulatory agencies and identifying good research funding mechanisms is a really important part of this. NCAT's worked with the FDA. This is the last thing I guess I'll mention. NCAT's worked with the FDA earlier this year to host a two-day workshop on repurposing off-patent drugs and some of the research and regulatory challenges that exist. And it's really not as simple as identifying a drug that works and taking it back to patients. It can be that simple, but there's no guarantee that the dose is right, that the formulation is right, that the way it's going to be delivered to patients at a healthcare setting is correct. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done with that candidate and the regulatory agency, and it can be expensive. It's not just a matter of taking the drug and using it in another way. It's easy to get a grant to do the really exciting research to identify those repurposing candidates. There is nothing exciting, as I'm sure many people will agree here, from a granting point of view about giving away $5 million for data generation that can't even be published. There's a real gap in terms of where funding comes from to enable the preclinical work needed to launch a clinical trial. And that's a really big challenge for us. So the workshop themes, really discussed a lot of different challenges. Regulatory pathways, there's not a lot of guidance there depending on the region. Incentives, there are very few commercial incentives. And I think that market exclusivity is exciting, but it only comes at the end after you've done all the work. And so that's why it's been difficult to get the private sector very involved. Data challenges in terms of data sharing. And then of course there are legal and legislative challenges. And while I think that we do see legislative change for new drugs, for example, in pediatric cancers in the United States, there's a new act passing this year that mandates that new drugs have to be trialed in a pediatric setting where it's appropriate and where they might work. We don't see that kind of legislative attention on repurposing of generic drugs, and I think we have a lot to do there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Can I just pick you up very quickly on one point that you were saying that repurposing has great successes in cancer. I'm not doubting it. I'm simply, if you can, whether you're talking about possibilities, opportunities, and potential, or whether you're talking about actual results where you can point to things and say that has made a difference.
Right. So I suppose that what I should qualify my statement by saying is that there aren't many. Thalidomide came up earlier for multiple myeloma. There aren't many remarkable examples of non-oncology drugs being repurposed for oncology, but certainly within the kingdom of clinical oncology, there are hundreds of cancers, and drugs are developed for individual cancers that are on patent and some that are generic. And demonstrating that they're effective for those hundreds of other cancers is meticulous clinical work that requires really well-controlled trials to demonstrate that there's benefit to the patient for each of those individual other cancers. And so, yeah, the reason drugs are used across multiple malignancies isn't just because they're there. There's got to be clinical confidence in the utilization. And so I consider those to be repurposing exercises, perhaps of a less dramatic scale in terms of the switch from original disease to the new indication, but it certainly requires a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of resources to do that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Can I, Dr. Eichler, are you still on the line there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you very much. I wondered if I could ask you if you have a response to the suggestion that Bissell advanced that there was a risk of a higher evidence demands being made sometimes of candidates for repurposing than for new drugs. Have you ever been conscious of that sort of differential or not?
So I totally agree with the notion that there should not be a differential standard. Of course not. But I would also caution to say that regulators should be proportionate in the standard and the data they require. And that is, we have lots of experience in decades, that should be in response to the unmet medical need. So would we allow a vaccine that is for primary prevention based on a cohort study of 100 patients? And the short answer is probably not. Well, very likely not. Could we allow a drug that is for a life-threatening disease where there is no other treatment option based on a cohort of 100 patients? And the answer has been yes. So bear that in mind. There is not one uniform standard, but there is a standard in proportion to the unmet need and the situation, the clinical situation that you are facing. But again, I totally agree that we should be agnostic to whether that comes from a for-profit, a not-for-profit company, whether it's a primary indication, whether it's a secondary. We should be following the science. But I would beg to differ in the sense that there is a differential standard. I'm not aware. Now you can say I'm colorblind because I'm part of the organization, but I am not aware of concrete situations where we have been asking for a higher standard because something was repurposed. So that would be my response.
Okay, well, thank you for that. While I have you there, perhaps can I bounce a question off you that came in from one of our participants, an anonymous question. It doesn't seem particularly dangerous. But he asked, could EMA provide an opinion or some other kind of assessment for a repurposed drug instead of a formal label extension in case robust data are provided by a third party who's not the marketing authorization holder? And I ask you that really in the light of what you just said about the fact that you have almost a sliding scale, if I can oversimplify it, in terms of the way that you assess things. In an emergency situation where there was no other treatment for a life-threatening disease, is there any mechanism of that sort that the EMA could contemplate recommending?
So what you're essentially asking is, could we, if we don't give a license or an extension of a license, which I wouldn't differentiate too much, if we don't do that, but we give a positive opinion and say, we have analyzed those data, we're satisfied, this is robust data, it looks like the benefits outweigh the risks. And then what? Good luck. So we would, in effect, make an off-label recommendation So that is not foreseen under our current legislation. So the short answer is no, we cannot do that. We cannot make off-label recommendations.
Yes.
Then the second question is, who triggers that? Should we trigger it? Well, there are mechanisms where, in the interest of public health, someone else could trigger us to assess that. But what would happen now? If we say we cannot do off-label recommendations, it would have to translate into a label. But who is the marketing authorization holder? And they get back to the obligation. It isn't just you get a new summary of product characteristics. It is not as simple as that. That has an afterlife. So should we oblige a marketing authorization then to look after that indication, which comes with a lot of workload, of obligations, of liabilities? The legal framework for that isn't there. So I was anticipating exactly that questions. Give an off-label recommendation. And no, I'm afraid in the current framework, if someone wants to change the law, that's a different matter. In the current law, we cannot do that.
Yes, yes, I fully understand that. There's a link question there. Forgive me, an awful lot of questions came in for you. So someone else asked also if, there's a question about dextromethasone. Bear with me one second. Forgive me. Yes, will AMA, another anonymous question, will EMA look at the data for dexamethasone in COVID-19 if no marketing authorization holder applies for a variation?
So here, forgive me, I cannot speak to ongoing cases for obvious reasons. But watch this space and maybe there will be an application, not before long.
Yeah, just let me step aside to file a story straight away on that. Well, thank you very much for that little hint. I wonder if thank you. The questions, I'm afraid, are all come in. I'm afraid, I'm not surprised. Questions have come in for you, Dr. Eichler, so far. But let me perhaps just bounce off the rest of the panelists there. This question of incentives. Nicolas, Professor Andre, one of the things that you were indicating was the sort of infrastructural or contextual challenges. What, not just in terms of companies getting involved in repurposing, but what incentives are there that could work for researchers themselves, given that normally speaking, you would be deriving your kudos from experimentation and studies through publications and so on, or patents, which is clearly not the timetable which we're working to in terms of repurposing drugs. Are there other incentives that you can imagine that might help to bring further action into further activity into this area?
I guess I may have a slightly different view from most people in here, because for me, it was just like, I was being an activist when I decided to engage in drug repurposing. I was really wanted to come up with treatment that would be available for any kids anywhere with cancer, right? Don't forget that most of the kids with cancer live in poor, low-income countries and have like really poor survival. And we focus on research on new drugs that are so expensive that they will never get access to it. So my perspective was a bit different. But for most people who just want to develop a field of research, I guess the issues are just money and the academic value of it. So if they can have the research funded easily, and that the paper with the same favorable results will get the same good journals, then that would be good enough, I guess.
Bissal, could I bounce the same question off you, see what your view is on this question of incentivization?
Yeah, incentivization is a big issue, and I guess I agree with what Nicolas said, but it also interlinks very well with the regulatory decision. So you lead a trial, and after the success of the trial gets EMA and FDA approval. So you can be proud of what you have achieved. But Nicolas leads a trial of a statin in glioblastoma. It comes out positive and looks like the drug is very efficacious, but now there is no mechanism or the money or the institution who will file for that label update with the EMA or the FDA, and the government is not going to do that, just like for hydroxychloroquine or dexamethasone, because it's not a pandemic. So then Nicola has successfully completed a trial. The drug looks good, but it does not get regulatory approval. So, you know, ultimately the whole chain is, I think, a part of the problem, in that there is no incentive to conduct the trial. There is no money to conduct the trial, and then there is no mechanism to file for regulatory changes after the results of the trial are published.
Okay, thank you. Matthew, from your
Just
perspective.
one comment. It was not glioblastoma, low-grade glioma, right?
Yes?
Sorry, I'll just give you an example.
Yeah, well, it makes a big difference though.
I should say, by the way, this question came in from Bettina Rao, who's on the Cancer Mission Board. Matthew, did you have a view on this yourself?
Well, only that, you know, the outcome of the workshop that NCATS hosted was that, you know, there really are not commercial incentives to invest in, because there is an enforceable market exclusivity. But that doesn't mean that shouldn't be the case. And I think it would be a fantastic outcome if there was a way to stimulate or to create a set of mechanisms that create that, so that those incentives were there. So at NCATS, with our therapeutic development program, we, up to the point of IND filing, we actually have a program that works with foundations and academics to fund that IND enabling work, so that the application for a clinical trial can be filed, because there are so few options there. So public funding and public spending is one way to make up that short gap, that incentive short gap that exists. But as we all know, there aren't many examples of that. And I think there's one way or another, a lot of work needs to be done to help bring these repurposed therapeutic opportunities to patients.
Okay, thanks. Delphine, can I come to you? Rita Rilla has asked, hello Ree, by the way, he has asked what you would think about reaching the balance between not getting on label because of the high standards involved versus the need of patients to have a response to their unmet need. How do you see that balance at the moment, and what should it be?
Well, I have to be full disclosure. I am in close contact with cancer, and it's a continuous battle against time. So when in your life and in the life of the people my organization represents, time is of the essence, I will always defend a pragmatic approach of defending unmet needs or trying to meet unmet needs before sorting out a very complex legal mayhem in the field of off-label drugs. But it doesn't mean that we're not working on both. So in my foundation, we both finance research, and so we're fighting against time, but we do advocacy work, and we're trying to bend or make sure that laws be amended in the right direction. So I'm inclined to say I'm fighting for both, but in a pragmatic fashion. I want to make sure that unmet needs be met first.
Okay, thanks. And just while you're there, perhaps, do you feel the role of patients in the discussion at both full policy level and at science level is sufficient at the moment? And if not, what might be done to improve that?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think that it's very recent that patients have been included in any sort of discussion, whether scientific or policy discussions. Many patients feel that they are not expert enough in their field to raise their voice, so there is a threshold or a barrier of entry. Nowadays there are more and more expert courses taking place to empower a patient and make sure that they can actually express their view on what is needed. And I am there because I think I have an important role to play without being immodest. But I think that patients have an interesting role to play because they have a very specific interest in the questions at stake, which is not career related. We don't want to publish, which is not led by profits because we're not going to make any money with any drug put on the market. And so I think that we have a specific role to play, and I think that we should, I mean, many structures should be rethought to include the role of patients, and also give an economic value to their participation. And when I'm saying that, I'm talking about the role of patients in many EMA committees, of HTA committees, and all these roles are being taken on by patients experts on a non-for-profit basis. I mean, they hardly get compensated. They get compensated for the actual costs. Their time is not being compensated. And it's also a barrier of entry to the activation of and to the empowerment of patients. I'm not sure I answered your questions, but I answered another one maybe.
Thank you very much for that. I'm afraid that we have reached the limits of our time here. And I'm very conscious of the fact that the agenda challenges it was that ACF set for this meeting has been very well met in some respects, but only partially. And for that, I'm afraid your moderator is entirely to blame. I have a list here, as it were, of all the desiderata that ACF imbued into me before we started this exercise. And as I look through it, I see that many of these areas we've neither solved nor in some cases discussed. On the funding issue, clearly the desire for greater public funding is there as an ambition and aspiration. But as one of you observed, the degree of competition in this area, I work as a journalist in Brussels, and every day I am reliably informed by probably 200 different organizations that their claim on funding or political attention or whatever is absolutely essential, and they must get to the head of the queue. There is just a massive demand here, and it's been articulated clearly by people in the panels today, but has not yet advanced towards an answer. The creative funding models of partnerships and so on are being explored, and clearly the Cancer Mission might open up some possibilities there. Although speaking for myself, I didn't get the feeling from listening to Dr. van der Loo that the Cancer Mission was going to suddenly jump up and rescue thousands of repurposing candidates from purgatory. But we will see what happens on that. Trial design, all this question of follow-up of exploratory findings that are promising by some well-designed and independent confirmatory trials. I think the merits of it are obvious and so on, particularly with platform trials as an advantage. But the difficulties of that have been spelt out by Hans-Georg and others, and the question of funding underlies that still. Questions of legislation, of making drugs available if they have added therapeutic value and have been repurposed in a legal framework. Well, Delphine spelled out also very clearly there the problems, and we're all aware of the difficulties of off-label use and the difficulties of legislative change. I can't remember how long I've been writing about the demands for European legislative change on off-label use, but it's no further on than when I was writing about it in Short Trousers. A simplified repurposing framework is also one of the demands or aspirations that I know ACF holds. Again, we've heard some eloquent views as to why this would be helpful. I'm not sure how that's going to be affected was addressed in what we were talking about. And then half a dozen infrastructure questions. Matthew, you pointed out the way that COVID had possibly shown some new degrees of cooperation and data sharing and so on. And I think that's evident in many areas, but whether it's transferable, whether it will survive into the post-COVID experience has to be still seen. There's plenty of endorsement of the concept of support of open science in Europe and everywhere else these days. It's very much à la mode, but again, sometimes more of an aspiration than a realization so far. I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just trying to sort of run through the things that we've talked about today in a very, very brief fashion. I wouldn't presume to offer the definitive view on this, But I'm fascinated personally by the discussion. It's helped to clarify an awful lot of the issues and given some very fine points of conflict or difference of view as well. I shall continue to follow it in a totally disinterested but very much interested fashion. And for me, all I can do now is to thank all of the speakers for their engagement, for the participants for watching, and for their questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all of them. And I'm now going to hand over finally to Lydie for a couple of final words. Thank you all very much from me.
Thank you all for the interesting discussion. And maybe one thing I would like to flag here at the end, it's not a solution, but it's about the case of Lydiant that some of you might know, where there's a big danger if you start an SME and for drug repurposing, that you have no control of the price. And that's what happened with Lydiant. And we were, instead of off-label use, we got an on-label drug and the price was times 500. And I think that's quite unacceptable situations. And I don't see a solution if we go that direction, how to avoid that type of situations. So yeah, there's pros and cons for every solution. But anyhow, I hope that you are convinced that drug repurposing is a valuable strategy to improve and accelerate patients' access to safe and affordable medicines. So, and to end on a positive note then, at the Anticancer Fund, we will continue to look for collaborations and solutions for the current hurdles in drug repurposing. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Bye.
Bye.